Okay, now, folks, in the case of Vietnam, I've already mentioned a little bit about it. I grew up with it, you might say. The Vietnam War got seriously started in 1965 after President Lyndon Johnson promised that United States troops would not get more involved in it. The Vietnam War is one of the worst, perhaps, events of our history. And your book takes the viewpoint that the United States was altogether at fault. In other words, the United States were the bad people. And it emphasizes, all right, here's what we did wrong. And I'm not going to deny that we actually did some of these things. First of all, we promised that we would not send troops to help the South. We wound up doing it. We also promised the South Vietnamese free elections. Well, we didn't give them free elections. Why not? Because we knew the communists would win. And folk, I want to tell you something. It's hard to know what to do in a case like this. Whether you want to stop communism, and there was a strong move to stop communism, and yet at the same time you want to do what's right, and sometimes your desire to do what's right and your desire to do what you want to do conflict. And this is the prime example. You might say it's easy for us to say many years later, more than 50 years down the road, we should have allowed the free elections and let the communists win, and then let the communists have all of Vietnam. Well, we tried. We tried to stop communism and couldn't. We did in South Korea. North Vietnam, Vietnam and Korea have a lot in common in that Vietnam was divided north and south, and so was Korea divided north and south. In the case of South Korea, by stopping communism, we let people survive for about almost 70 years now. And during this time, the South Koreans have built up a good economy, learned how to manufacture, set up factories, sell their products, while North Korea is starving. In the case of Vietnam, we never succeeded in westernizing those people. Purely and simply. The man in charge, Diem, began to root out dissenters. Now, in other words, folk, the Shah of Iran did the same thing. Would not allow dissent, and you know how much I believe in the freedom of dissent. But Diem began to rule with an iron fist and quelch everybody who disagreed with him. And again, if any of us had been in his shoes, we might have done the same thing. Then, after promising we would not fight on the side of the South, after promising we'd give them free elections, which we didn't do, we then began fighting on the side of the South against the communists, contrary to the agreement set at Geneva, the Geneva Accords. Ho Chi Minh then retaliated by promoting revolution. So here's what we were fighting. Vietnam. We were fighting North Vietnam, of course. All of North Vietnam was communist. Among the South, you had the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese. The Viet Cong were communist, which basically means that the South were half communist anyway. The bottom line is Vietnam was 3/4 communist. Approximately half of South Vietnam were communist, and North Vietnam remained united. Now, what these people were partly rebelling against was colonialism. They saw that France was weak after France had a bad showing in World War II, so they revolted against France. First, though, they had to try to keep out the Japanese because Japan went in and took Vietnam from France. So they had to fight off the Japanese. And then They fought off the French. The French lost a few big battles and decided, hey, we can't fight a war half, we're 10,000 miles away. That's how far it was. And no easy, good way to get there without going all the way around Africa or maybe going around South America. I mean, to get by boat from France to Vietnam takes some doing and is expensive. So the French pulled out. Then it was up to either the United States to move in or stay out. And to make a long story short, the United States actually moved in. Now, 1964 was an election year, and President Lyndon Johnson, who took Kennedy's place after Kennedy was assassinated, promised the United States will not get involved in Vietnam. In the meantime, though, we were losing, our side was losing. The North Vietnamese were winning and gaining ground. So to solve that, the United States began sending advisors. They called them advisors at first. In other words, persons who were there just to advise, which is the same thing that we're doing to some extent in Afghanistan and in Iraq, sending advisors. Well, after a while, as well, these advisors were not enough, so we actually started sending ground troops.
Can you go back a little bit? You said 1964 election.
Yeah, Lyndon Johnson ran on a platform of I'll stay out, LBJ.
He said he promised we would not get involved.
Not get involved. And as soon as the election was over,
were we involved?
We were involved in a limited way before then. Let's see, Eisenhower just said, well, the United States is not in. See, Eisenhower ended the Korean War.
Right.
And Eisenhower also had seen a lot of war in World War II. So he said, you know, our young men, he'd seen young men torn apart or whatever in World War II, and he was against war, basically. Even though he was himself a general, a 5-star general, he was against war. And he kept us out of Vietnam. Then Kennedy came in and tried to get us a little bit more involved. But see, all right, again, the mood of the country. In Eisenhower's administration, Hungary revolted and the United States lost. In Eisenhower's administration, we looked weak. Kennedy said, we're going to look strong. So Kennedy's first move, during Ike's term, Cuba was taken. So we lost in Cuba, we lost in Hungary, and we were losing in Vietnam. And somebody said, America will not be pushed around. Now, I'll say this about Eisenhower. When he left office, he was rated as a very mediocre president. But as time has gone on, he's looked on as being higher and higher and higher and better, because after we went through Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs, Johnson and Vietnam, Nixon and Watergate, Gerald Ford and inflation and unpopularity, and Jimmy Carter and extreme unpopularity and high inflation, after we went through those presidents, Eisenhower began to look better and better and better down through the years, until we wrote that maybe Eisenhower's attitude of let's stay uninvolved was really the right course of action.
My dad's reading a book on Eisenhower right now.
Oh.
That it kind of touches on what you said, how, you know, publicly he seemed kind of weak and not a great president. And this book is backing up all, as time goes on, like you said, it keeps showing that Eisenhower kind of made the right moves as opposed to...
Well, see, also during his time, the Soviets beat us into space. But then again, their equipment was crude.
Right.
And Ike knew that. He said, well, we built up everywhere. And in the long run, we beat them to the moon.
Right.
But in the short run, I mean, okay, they got the first satellite. They put the first dog up and couldn't bring him back down. They put 8 cosmonauts and astronauts up, and all of them were killed. Right. They finally got one, just Gagarin, who barely survived. I mean, I'm not questioning he went. Right. Then Tito, so their capsules were bigger than ours. But we had better miniaturization. And in the long run, that was going to cost them. And, but anyway, Eisenhower did not, I mean, he was determined to keep us out of Vietnam. Kennedy was determined to get us in. But then Kennedy, some people believe that, if you're into conspiracy theories, that Kennedy was shot partly because, actually, there were people in a country who wanted us in, and Kennedy, I'm going to contradict myself, but Kennedy didn't. So, and also there is a rumor going around about Kennedy's assassination that he was killed by communists, that He was killed because he was trying to bump off Fidel Castro, but Castro beat him to the draw. So any of you who are into conspiracy theories might have heard this, and I believed this for a good many years, and a part of me still wonders about this. Was Kennedy killed because Castro beat him to the draw? But anyway, Johnson promised to keep us out, and as soon as he was firmly re-elected, he got us in. It proved to be Johnson's undoing because it made him very unpopular. The war lasted, let's see, well, 1964, well, no, let's start with 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72. That's 8 years, actually going on longer than that, but 8 years from the time Johnson got us involved. It ended in January 1973, but it really ended in the spring of 1975. When it ended, your book makes it sound like that the North Vietnamese they were determined to have one Vietnam, united Vietnam. But then, when Nixon made overtures to China in 1971, Nixon went to China, and China stopped helping Vietnam, and Russia let it be known they were not going to help North Vietnam. The Vietnamese were forced to the negotiating table, and after 5 years of negotiating, the Vietnamese finally agreed to a peace treaty that was not worth anything. So in January 1973, the Vietnam War ended. In 1975, North Vietnam made an all-out invasion on South Vietnam. The United States would not help the North Vietnamese anymore. And really, North Vietnam had an easy time. The South Vietnamese would not fight. And the United States had lost its first war. If you look at it in a little bit more detail, in 1968, the country elected Richard Nixon, and Nixon was copying Eisenhower. When Eisenhower was elected, he said, I will go to Korea. So once elected, he went to Korea. Nixon, when he was elected, he went to Vietnam. And then Nixon began pulling troops out of Vietnam, men who would not be replaced. In other words, it wasn't like, all right, the Vietnam War was unlike any other. In all other wars, you enlisted for the duration, and you stayed till the war was over. But for Vietnam, all right, a typical Vietnam soldier, he was about 18 and a half years old when all of a sudden he found himself drafted in the Army. So he'd go to take a physical. If he passed the physical, go join the Army and sign up for 2 years of active duty and 4 years with either Reserve or National Guard. 6-year military obligation. Well, all right. Once in the Army, he'd undergo basic training for about 3 months. Then he'd get a 30-day leave of absence, 30 days to go home and say goodbye to his friends. Then he'd go to Vietnam for a year. At the end of the year, he'd get another 30. He'd come back home and get 30 more days off. By that time, his term of enlistment was almost, for 2 years, almost up. In other words, 1 month of basic training, 1 month off, 12 months, that's 14 months. Then 1 month of off after that, that's 16 months. He had 8 months left. They'd make a sergeant out of him and he'd train young recruits. This is a typical story of a Vietnamese soldier, of a United States soldier serving in Vietnam. He'd served for a year, and for a young man, 1 year can be an awfully, awfully long time. But 50,000 of them were killed. Some 600,000 or 700,000 Americans saw service in Vietnam, most of whom returned after a year. The war was dirty. It was mostly guerrilla tactics. And of all the other wars, it was said the wars we fought was most like Vietnam was the Indian Wars, where we'd march along, and all of a sudden the Vietnamese would start shooting at us, and we had to train our troops. Now, when the jungle around you becomes alive with gunfire, don't take cover, but charge into the foliage. And this proved to be effective, and eventually the M16 rifle was invented. The M16 rifle that only weighed about 3 pounds. The old rifles that we used, it was very difficult to carry around in the jungle heat. But the M16 weighed about 3 pounds, and a version of it still used, but it was effective. But it would get, I mean, they would suppose they would charge in the jungle, but if they didn't, if the troops panicked, or sometimes they did, the whole battle was lost. But North Vietnamese units were told to avoid the unit with a black rifle. The black rifle was the M16 rifle. Eventually, every unit had the black rifle. And this did put the North Vietnamese to terror. The kill ratio, if you believe, and I do believe our figures, was about 10-1. We killed 10 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to every one of our men who were killed. But they kept coming back. The loss of Vietnam was somewhat offset by the gain with China. And after we improved relations with China, the United States abandoned its aid to Taiwan, or the Republic of China, or Formosa, call it what you will. The island is called the island of Formosa. The nation is now called the Republic of China, or ROC. And folk, China can invade Taiwan at any minute now. And nobody knows what the United States would do. At one point, we offered protection to Taiwan. Today, we supposedly don't. The fact is, we don't know what would happen. All right. Anyway, Vietnam. A big loss to the United States. A bad memory. Your Vietnam era veterans are now getting older. I myself, all right, I escaped it. Here's how. By staying in school until they came up with a new draft law. Now, under the old draft law, a man had to sweat it every month. They draw your birthday out of a hat. And if your birthday came up, well, they finally said, we're going to have one big super draft. So in April 1970, they had one big final draft for all of us baby boomers, everyone born from 1952 and before, all of us who were eligible. And I drew number 206, my birthday. And 190 was as high as they were allowed to go. No draft board could go higher than 190, but I drew number 26. So I didn't, but later I did join the Army. And I have a book at home that says generals trained their troops real hard for the last war. I joined the Army in 1980 and we trained for Vietnam. Now today they train for desert warfare, but when I joined in 1980, we trained to go to Vietnam. Again, generals training us for the last war. What more can I say? I mean, believe me, we could spend a whole semester talking in detail about what all went on. All right. A few terms. Equivalence. This did not come along. This was part of our relationship with Russia, with the Soviet Union. That's an A. That's making sure that both sides are equal in strength, and one side then won't be stronger than the other. This would help assure that there would not be a war. If the other side knew that your side had as much as they did, or if you knew that they had as much as you did. Détente, cooperation. In the late 1970s, you heard a lot about détente. That meant cooperation between us and them. All the while, inside the Soviet Union was decaying from within, more so than we were aware of. Détente, equivalence, and then, oh yeah, you might hear the term evil empire. Ronald Reagan's term for the Soviet Union, the evil empire. All right, now, we had our Vietnam. It was humiliating. In the meantime, the Soviet Union made a huge mistake also. In 1979, while the United States was busy becoming entangled with Iran, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now, Great Britain had done this once. Soviet Union did it. Every outside nation that has invaded Afghanistan has lost, except for the Muslims. They came from outside, they overran it. But the United States, for the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The war lasted 8 years and it ended with a Soviet defeat. How did the Soviets lose? Simply because the Afghani people, like the Vietnamese, would not quit fighting. Afghanistan has been compared to Vietnam, where a big country takes on what looks like a smaller, weaker country. But then the Afghanis, like the Vietnamese, they had learned jungle warfare for more than 1,000 years. They'd used it against China. Afghanistan doesn't have jungles, but they have caves, they have deep ravines, and they have a lot of hiding places, and outsiders simply don't know where the hiding places are. And even with our satellites flying overhead, we can't always know where their troops are because they've learned how even to evade our satellites. But the Soviet Union did not have that stuff then. 1979, the Afghan War did a lot to bring about the Soviet Union. And by 1988, it was obvious to the Soviets that they could not win. Well, in 1989, 3 countries, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, broke off from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would have forced them back in except for one thing. All of the 16 republics that made up the Soviet Union went their separate way. One of them was named Georgia. There's now an independent country called Georgia. It was once part of the Soviet Union. But there's Georgia, Armenia, Belarus, White Russia, of course, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, then the Stans. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, other nations that end in Stan. And they all broke away at once, and there was nothing the Soviet Union could do about it. Today, the Soviet Union is no longer considered a superpower. Nikita Khrushchev used to say, "We'll bury you." And he'd say, "We're going to take over the West without firing a shot." Instead, what happened was his country fell without the West firing a shot. The Soviet Union is no more. I read an article recently about 50 countries that have existed in the last 200 years that don't exist now. One of them was the Soviet Union. The United States did send aid to Afghanistan, but we would not get involved because of actual fighting because of what we call the Vietnam Syndrome. Vietnam Syndrome, we're afraid of getting involved in a war. Now, folk, I've had a student more than one criticize this. What's going on right at this minute in our country is Congress is getting up a bill to make sure that our present president does not go to war in Iraq without its approval. This is up in Congress right now. And President Trump has promised to veto it. But nevertheless, it's still part of the Vietnam Syndrome. You know, we don't want our president just making war. We want to tie the president's hands and make sure he doesn't make war without the approval of Congress first. Again, I'm not going to take sides on that issue. I mean, I can see both sides. Now, Ronald Reagan, okay, folks, let me say this. If you read the book, a lot of what I say, I'm going to say and then have to back up and repeat it again. That's because when we get to recent times, these stories are happening at the same time, but we just can't jump around and talk about Vietnam and then talk about the Kennedy assassination. I mean, you know, they were separate stories, but they were occurring at the same time, if you know what I mean. So we're going to be doing some backing up. But anyway, Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, and he began an arms race against the Soviet Union. Now, I joined the Army in 1979, and we feared at that time we were behind. Well, Ronald Reagan said, we're going to get ahead of the Soviet Union, so he built up our armaments. The Soviet Union tried to keep up, but they did not have the economic means that we did. To make a long story short, by 1990 it was obvious the Soviet Union was going to collapse. Now, a lot of folk try to take credit for breaking down the Soviet Union. The Catholic Church says that Pope John Paul II did it. A lot of people who admire Ronald Reagan say Ronald Reagan did it, but I'm going to tell you who I really believe brought down the Soviet Union. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. You catch my drift, folk? You know who all these men are? They were the Soviet Union's only. The Soviet Union brought itself down. It was not brought down from outside. It was brought down from within by its own leaders and its own Communist Party. They did everything that was necessary to bring it down. And Ronald Reagan does not deserve credit, except it happened on his watch. You might say, his happened during his term. Anyway, now something else. Ronald Reagan got up an idea of a Star Wars plan based on the movie Star Wars, which some of you might have happened to have seen. I have seen a couple of them myself, but I'm no fan of that. But anyway, supposedly we would put satellites into orbit that would catch incoming missiles. But if you know anything about it, I mean, a satellite in orbit cannot stay still. I mean, like, here's the Earth. Satellites have to keep moving, folk, in order to stay up. If they slow down, they fall down, but they have to move at 5 miles a second. Well, what if a satellite were located right here, and a missile was seen coming into us from right over here? It would take that satellite 45 minutes, and we'd have to have a whole series of satellites in Earth orbit, and then if one started, we sense an incoming missile. Now, this is not as true now as it was, but for more than 50 years, those persons in the know realize that if the Soviet Union ever fired a nuclear rocket at us, what could we do about it? Absolutely nothing. Now today we believe we have missiles against anti-missiles. We talk about developing 90X, we talk about developing anti-missile missiles, but it was never done. Well, today we have them, and we think we could stop an incoming missile. And of course, this has been a big matter of concern in recent times, not with the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist, but with North Korea. North Korea has been developing missiles which they'll fire over Japan to try to prove that they can make a missile that'll reach the United States. And one of their missiles is known to have flown up on the ground and destroyed their ability to fire any more missiles. But they might make a comeback. Anyway. Now, Ronald Reagan tried to stop communism in Latin America, particularly in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And his administration, now, listen to me carefully. Ronald Reagan's administration did support the Contras in Nicaragua illegally. Congress had outlawed the support, but Ronald Reagan did support. This led to the big scandal of the Reagan administration, which I'll talk about later. But it was called the Iran-Contra scandal, where that we supported Iran against Iraq when they got into war. Well, actually, the Iran-Iraq war occurred at the same time that the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan. But again, these are separate stories. So, but the way we had to watch them when I was a young man was they were unfolding at the same time. And we would go for months at a time without hearing much about the Afghan war or the Iran-Iraq war. But they were going on at the same time. And basically, it put the bad guys against each other and gave us more time and more freedom. When Iran started fighting Iraq, Henry Kissinger said, "Too bad only one side can lose." He was wrong, both sides lost. And when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we actually were on Afghanistan's side, but the Soviet Union lost. So these wars did a lot to help us, even though we did not get directly involved. All right. With that, we're starting